and chat that into us, and we will do a Q&A session after the presentation today. So with us, we have Dr. Tim DelCurto, who is a professor from Montana State University and also Nancy Chair in Animal Range Sciences. From PBS to the Beef Improvement Federation to various animal science conferences, Tim has spoke and focused his research on sustainable beef production and passionate about the livestock industry in his research. His research is involving the optimal use of dormant, low-quality forage by evaluating strategic supplementation and other methods to enhance the use of rangeland forages while decreasing the reliance on harvest feeds. So today we have Tim DelCurto. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Carla. I will pull up my slideshow here and make sure this is going to work. Oops, it's not where I wanted to be. Okay, can everyone see that fine, Carla?
I can see it just fine, Tim.
Okay. Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank CLOC and for those folks that are participating in this seminar. To be honest, essentially all I'm going to talk about today is our use of primarily the SmartFeed Pro technology and how we've incorporated into our research, kind of our experiences with the technology. And I guess from my perspective, you know, if we can help other researchers, and make decisions on how they're going to use technology, and two, maybe avoid some of the mistakes we've made, then I'll feel like this seminar was a success. Welcome to sunny Montana right now. Just so you know, 2 days ago we were -20 with about 8 inches of snow. Today we're balmy. It's about 20 degrees above zero, and we're expecting highs in the 50s by this weekend. So pretty typical Montana weather and Montana fall. I think before I start talking about the SmartFeed Pro, I think we have to acknowledge the role that GrowSafe has played in the technology area, particularly when it comes to feed intake and feed intake behavior research. Really been the standard in technology for almost 20 years now, looking at individual animals and intake behavior. And if you travel like I get to across North America, you know, one of the things that you see very clearly is that standard equipment in many USDA and land-grant university settings. On the MSU campus, I use roughly 22 feed units in our beef research. Most of the CLOC or GrowSafe systems are associated with experimental feedlot or digestion barn settings. We also have 8 units with our sheep research unit. And then our Northern Ag Research Center, under the direction of Dr. Darren Boss, has a research feedlot with 32 feed units, 16 individual pens with 2 GrowSafes. So we have an experience with all these technologies and have worked a lot with GrowSafe as well as CLOC in terms of designing our research and use of these technologies. It's fascinating to me to travel around and look at industry applications of this technology. You know, one that's pretty close to us, the Midland Bull Test in Montana is one of the largest bull tests where they look at feed intake behavior. Midland actually has 24 pens of 50 head of bulls that they take on each fall. That works into a bull test with 1,200 bulls. Each one of those pens is fitted or set up with a bank of 8 GrowSafe feeders where they look at feed intake, you know, feed to gain ratios or gain to feed, however you want to express it. Also, they calculate RFIs and a number of things. So fairly unique applications And we currently at Montana State work with Midland with some of these databases. Also, if you ever get a chance, visit the Simplot Grandview feedlot outside of Mountain Home, Idaho. They have research pens again set up with GrowSafe feeders, and so we're seeing application of this technology beyond just academia, but also used in the industry. Today, at the request of CLOC, I'm going to talk about our experiences with SmartFeed Pro technology and really even just our relationships with CLOC and how that relationship has evolved over the last 4 years. You got to remember, I'm approaching 60 years old, so when I say relatively new, that means in the last 5-10 years, but CLOC's a relatively new entry into the feed or measuring feed intake and feed intake behavior technology. I found them to be a company that's really unique in that they're very active in developing equipment for unique challenges and opportunities. My personal experience at Montana State University actually started about 4.5 years ago. I just accepted the position at Montana State as an endowed chair in range beef cattle nutrition and management. And I was at the National Animal Science meetings in Salt Lake, Utah, and went up to the CLOC booth. And they were showing their SmartFeed feeders and some of the technology. And I started a conversation with them about the kinds of things that I wanted or was wanting to have for my research program at Montana State University. And specifically, I wanted some equipment that would measure supplement intake in very remote locations. And by very remote, really extensive rangelands, rough topography, not a place where power or any kind of utilities would be accessible. So no power, no internet, fairly severe environment. And essentially, the whole goal, the research program that I was trying to develop in my mind was essentially a precision nutrition approach to managing cattle in extensive fall and winter rangeland environments. And, also interested in how then we can take that data and help commercial beef cattle producers throughout the West. To be honest, in my initial conversations with CLOC, what I envisioned, and this is, always remember that university professors are not mechanics, nor are we all that creative, but I was just going to bolt for these CLOC or SmartFeed feeders to a flatbed trailer, take it, obviously mount solar panels and mount them to this trailer and take them out to fairly extensive range environments. Probably take a backhoe and dig a hole where I could drop the axle into the hole and try to measure feed intake. So I met him in July. In August, I started conversations primarily with Scott, but I think Mike Pillars might have been involved with that too, about what I wanted or what I was planning on doing. And basically, they essentially said, I think we understand your vision, allow us to build something that will work for you rather than just me buy the equipment and mount it to a flatbed trailer. So keep in mind, I was just going to buy a flatbed trailer and mount feeders to. This is what CLOC delivered that November. And so really a much more functional feed unit than what I had envisioned. It's one that actually we've been very proud of. This winter, we'll start our 5th winter of using the SmartFeed Pro Trailers. This trailer is set up here with 4 feeding stations. We have 2 of them that are identical. They're actually an old ice house, or not an old ice house, an ice house trailer. And so you can actually take them out to remote locations. You can retract the wheels, and the trailer itself will sit flat on the ground. You really just need a level spot. That's roughly about 20 feet by 10 feet in length to set the trailer on. And so that was really the start. These trailers were delivered fall of 2016, and we jumped right into the research with them. And to be honest, there's certainly some trial and error, trying to figure out the best way to do it. For the initial studies, just so most of you know, which we'll talk about, we locked the gates open and we actually widened the area around the feed bunk, so we had no cows getting their heads stuck in there. And our goal with the initial studies anyway was just looking at ad lib intake of a self-limited or self-fed supplement that was limited primarily by salt. And so that's how we got started with this research. To sort of backtrack a little bit, and I think, what I wanted to do today is talk about kind of why we think this kind of technology is important in research. I think it's good to go back and look at just beef cattle feed intake and how we've done that kind of work in the past. First of all, beef cattle feed intake is pretty easy in backgrounding or feedlot scenarios where you're bunk feeding and you can monitor intake quite readily in those kinds of scenarios. Also, by and large, most of the grow-safe technology has been primarily adapted for those kind of confined animal feeding scenarios. For cow-calf production research, feed intake actually becomes a bit more challenging. And so I'm always interested when I see papers that have a feed intake component, particularly with cows in grazing environments and even more so in fairly extensive rangeland environments. But, in my opinion, feed intake, digestion or digestibility of forage are really two critical components of animal nutrition that sometimes I think gets lost in the academic world. The previous research prior to this new technology, quite frankly, was difficult. And I'm going to kind of walk you through some examples of how basically in my research program over the last 30 years, we did research in a way so we could get it published. But by doing so, more often than not, we missed a lot of really important information about strategic supplementation and how cows respond to supplemental inputs in extensive environments. And just so you know, I've had people go, well, you're kind of making fun of past research. Just so you know, every single slide I'm going to show is actually my past research. So I'm making fun of myself to a bit, but most of you are probably familiar with these kinds of study situations where you have cattle out in a common pasture. And in order to get enough experimental units to have statistical inference, we would actually bring cattle in daily or 3 times a week. We'd sort them into replicated pens, and we would feed supplements much like this matter here. This is at Oregon State University's Union experiment station. And for several years, we would do winter grazing kinds of research where either daily or 3 times a week, we'd bring cows in, we'd sort them into their unique pen groups, and then feed the supplement. Honestly, it's pretty good research and pretty good research model, but the problem with it is when you look at cow performance or cow intake, they're based on pen averages. So we know nothing about variation of supplement intake, or we know nothing about nutrient delivery systems of the supplement with diverse groups of cattle that are ran in common in pastures or rangelands. So this is some of the past research that I've done. When I first started at Oregon State and I was at the Burns Research Station, I think you're more ambitious when you're first starting out. And we actually did research in 2,000-acre pastures where we gathered cattle daily, sorted them into individual pens, and fed their supplement by hand. But to put this in perspective, you know, literally these were at least 84-day studies, or the goal was 84-day studies. Sometimes they went as long as 100 days. It would take half the day to gather the cows, sort them into the pens, drive to this remote location, and then the other part of the day was spent weighing up the individual amounts of feed to go to the specific cows based on their treatment allocations. I have a lot of people go, well, boy, isn't this technology expensive? And I think when you look at how we used to do research, I would contend that it's not. These kinds of studies actually would require, you know, 3 to 4 months of labor just to feed the cows and get the statistical rigor. The other problem with these older studies, and keep in mind I'm making fun of my own research, is that you really disturb the normal grazing patterns of these cows when you gather them on a 2,000 acre pasture and sort them into individual pens and feed them. You know, it sort of takes a natural setting and makes it sort of unnatural, kind of in a hurry when you do these kinds of studies. So when you apply the technology we're going to talk about today, you know, you can see that there's certainly applications. Finally, when I think about beef cattle intake, you know, and how we actually do it with grazing animals, and particularly in extensive environments, generally most of the past research has been done with some sort of combination of external or internal markers. You know, most of the literature that you read oftentimes will have a daily supplement feeding protocol where they put an external marker such as chromic oxide, or nowadays it might be titanium, something like that in the supplement. And ultimately what you get with that then would be fecal output. And then if you have a digestibility estimate, you know, you can come up with actual feed intakes or supplement intakes depending on what your goals are. Sustained release boluses were a fairly important tool for a number of years, but when Captech stopped making boluses, it sort of curtailed this research, at least for the time being. We're hopeful that Dr. Eric Schellender's will have a bolus in the very near future. I know he's working on one at New Mexico State University. But, you know, the thing I want you to realize is the old research, because of the techniques and fundamental problems with the technique, had limited applications. Intake was estimated typically over a 5 to 7 day period of collecting fecal samples. And keep in mind, this is probably following at least a 10 to 14 day of marker equilibration, where you want the marker to be fed for a certain amount of time so it's uniformly distributed throughout the GI tract. Then you take 5 to 7 days of fecal collections scattered across the time of day because of non-uniform passage of marker as a function of time. And so you would get an estimate of forage intake and perhaps an estimate of supplement intake, but you really didn't get an estimate of daily intake. What you got was an average over this 5 to 7 day window. And so it really did not help in terms of looking at intake variation. And there's really limited ability to look at sort of the interaction of intake, supplement intake, forage intake, and environment. For my research program at Montana State University, and really the years I spent at Oregon State University, we've always focused on, you know, sustainable beef cattle production systems, how to use the forage base or the resources that we have available. And so we're really looking at two things. One, you know, how do you optimize the use of this forage base? And two, how do you define cows or traits of cows that fit this environment, you know, for producers in these sort of limited nutrition environments. For my research program at Montana State, one of our real specific focuses is on extending the grazing season later into the fall and during the winter forage period. For our producers, they see this as very important, in part because they think it's going to be an economical alternative to harvested forages. You know, less equipment, labor is a problem for Western range beef cattle producers. And so by extending the grazing season, reducing reliance on harvested forages, they see that as kind of what the future holds. It may be, depending on you know, political trends here in North America, it may also be a approach to reducing the fossil fuel input, and we'll just have to see how that works out. It also, when we extend the grazing season, allows for increased use of rangelands outside the growing season. For many of our bunchgrass rangelands throughout the western U.S., a lot of these bunch grasses are not particularly tolerant of grazing while they're actively growing. So when we increase the use in the fall and the winter, we actually could have positive ecological benefits to that forage base. And we can use fall and winter grazing to restore and improve rangelands. And then finally, you know, a lot of our producers, and I tend to agree with this assessment, is when you extend the grazing season, and the ranchers call it keep the cows in their working clothes. Many cases you have healthier cows, more physically fit, they calve easier and tend to do better. However, keep in mind, everything I've talked about to this point is still a beef production system that's going to have to figure out how to optimize the use of high fiber, low quality forages. And it's also a system that's going to have to look at how to fit cattle to a specific environment. The new technologies such as CLOCs, a SmartFeed system, really have been important for us in refining the knowledge of strategic supplementation. So to kind of look at this in terms of a research model, an overall research model, when we think about strategic supplementation, you know, we first and foremost think about, well, what's the optimal nutrient delivery system? And what we mean by that is how do we get the right amount of nutrients to the right animal at the right time? This is obviously our SmartFeed Pro trailers. This is at our Northern Ag Research Center's Thackeray Ranch. This picture is taken in December. The forage base there's a lot of forage, but it's not very good in quality. So our goal here was to look at how these self-fed, salt-limited supplements worked with a very diverse group of cows that range from really from yearlings all the way to 12-year-old cows. So we use that technology primarily look at optimal nutrient delivery systems. Keep in mind our goal here is by understanding nutrient delivery to optimize the use of this forage. And then finally, to, you know, and this is probably unique to our research program, but also figure out ways to blend the supplementation program into the optimization of fairly diverse, extensive rangelands. So what we added to this experimental model, you can see there's cows here that have GPS collars where my pointer's at. And then we also added a weather station that really took a weather data on a 5-minute basis. And then we linked that to our supplement intake and our grazing clocks to get sort of this big picture of how cattle use rangelands in a fairly challenging winter environment. I'm going to talk to you about just 2 studies on any kind of detail, but mostly just to you know, kind of let you know how we've used the technology, kind of what our experiences are. The first study is relatively simple in design, is Dr. Sam Weifel's PhD project, where he looked at supplement intake and cow age on grazing behavior in rangeland use patterns. Sam actually has recently published this data. The actual supplement intake and cow age data is in the Journal of Animal Science. And just in the last month, his grazing behavior kinds of and environment work has been published in PLOS ONE. But just so you know, we have a number of other students both PhD and masters that are using this technology and looking at grazing, in different aspects of beef cattle production in extensive environments. Okay, so in the first 2 years, just to talk about just the technology and the kinds of data we had, I thought I'd just run through just some of the observations we had. In year 1, which was a 45-day grazing period, in year 2 was a 60-day grazing period. We had 42,000 visits in year 1 over a 45-day period, and in year 2 we had 65,000 visits. It turns out that, you kind of do the math really quick. We had about 1,000 visits today or per day with the 2 trailers set up in 8 different feeding stations. When we looked at the actual distribution of feed intake over the 24-hour period, you see somewhat of a normal distribution pattern where the peak intake of supplement was roughly about midday or noon, with very little consumption of supplement, during the nighttime hours. That suggested to us that probably the 8 feeding stations worked for the number of animals that we had on this study. For most of you, this is just a review, but unique aspects of the SmartFeed Pro units is when a cow sticks its head anywhere close to the feeder, you get a reading, a cow EID reading that immediately is time stamped with the time of day, the day, and then a series of weights, and ultimately, as long as there was feed consumed from the supplement, and entry and exit time are recorded. So you can do a number of things with just that raw data. For our research, we then coupled this data with weather stations, GPS collars, and activity monitors to get as close as we could to, a large picture of what the cattle were doing on the landscape. For the first 2 years of this study, with essentially a canola-based supplement that was 25% salt, we saw an average intake over both years of roughly 2.75 pounds or 1.5 kilograms. That was actually higher than what the label suggested, so we're fairly happy with that. In year 1, we started out with 272 cows. We had 264 feed records, and so we had 8 non-eaters in year 1. 4 of the non-eaters had EID tags that didn't work, and 4 of the cows were basically temperament issue cows that quite frankly were afraid of the feeders. But when you look at this, we actually, a significant number used it. In year 2, we actually had more cows. We had 306, and that particular year, we made sure all the EID tags were working, but we ended up with only 302 that actively used the feeders. And I'll talk about this. To be honest, this is really good success rate, and there's a reason for this, which I'll talk about a little bit later. To me, what's really unique about this technology is the kinds of data you can get. This is just looking at supplement intake. And we split the cows here into 6 age classes. Age class 1 here is this group. These are yearling cattle. Age class 2 is 2 and 3 year old cows, 4 and 5, 6 and 7, 8 and 9, and 10 and older. And so what you see here is actual intake patterns for year 1. The target intake for this was actually 1 kilogram per head per day, and so you can see we greatly exceeded that. In year 2, a little different feed intake pattern where basically the yearlings ate less than all the other cows, but you can see they're fairly consistent. To me, one of the really unique aspects of this kind of research and what this technology gives you is we can actually count standard errors within age group and look at variation around these means. And what's surprising, there's a number of surprising things here, but the literature up to this point had suggested that when you feed large groups of fairly diverse cows in extensive environments, that the young cows and the old cows don't get the supplement, and the middle-aged cows eat all of it. In this case, with this 25% salt limited supplement, that just simply wasn't true. The young cows actually ate the most and had the least amount of variation around those means. And you kind of see, and there's some subtle differences among year. In Dr. Weifels's research, one of the really interesting things he did is he modeled environmental effects, cow age, and how that then interacted with supplement intake behavior. And lo and behold, one of his best fit models showed a year by cow age by intake interaction. And what we actually observed was, again, with the same 6 age classes, the red line here would be the yearling cows, the yellow line would be 2 and 3 year old, 4 and 5, 6 and 7, 8 and 9, and 10 and older, is that actual supplement intake interacted with environmental temperature. Young cows, when it was really cold, ate the most supplement, but as it warmed up, young cows' supplement intake declined. Whereas with old cows, 8, 9, 10 and older, when it got real cold, they didn't eat much supplement, but as it warmed up, those supplement intakes went up. And it's kind of interesting too, when you go back to the previous picture and you look at, well, why did we see the difference from year to year? One of the reasons very easily could be in year 1, the actual mean temperature was quite a bit colder than year 2. It's pretty close to averaging minus 10 degrees Celsius. If you draw a line, here from 10 degrees up through there, you see a very distinct age effect. Year 2 is a much warmer study period, is close to -2 degrees, and you draw a line up through that, and it really sort of explains some of that variation we saw in supplement intake from year to year. The other thing we found out here in Montana, or at least maybe I found out, is that winters can have an extreme effect on nutrient needs of animals. And the other thing, we're actively combining weather stations with all our data, in part because, the last real improvements in terms of National Research Council models was with this publication on the right in 1981. These publications and our NRC models primarily focus on energy, very little mention of protein, minerals, and vitamins. And they generally encourage you to increase energy as a function of cold stress and hair coats, but it's limited in respect to wind chills and things like that. We had those 2 winters on that previous slide, very cold conditions and wind chills that sometimes would approach -50 degrees, Fahrenheit. And that would really put these cows in a negative energy balance. And so we're using weather stations combined with CLOC and things like that to sort of get at that. We've also done a number of studies really looking at matching beef cattle production in the Western range environments. We've looked at mature cow weaning weight ratios and cow size on intake and grazing behavior. And this study actually used the SmartFeed Pro Trailers, both in a range environment as well as a dry lot, total mixed ration environment. Corey Parsons, PhD, is looking at residual feed intake estimates on heifers and how that then relates to lifetime cow productivity, feed intake, and grazing behavior. And so we use the technology in a number of different research environments in a lot of different ways. The last study I kind of wanted to talk to you about before I just sort of talk about our experiences with the trailer was Haley White's master's research, where all she really wanted to look at was the impacts of salt limited supplements, or the physical form of salt limited supplements, on supplement intake behavior and performance of yearling heifers in a grazing dryland pasture. So these were yearling heifers, summer pastures, and really all we wanted to do in this study is look at a supplement that was essentially the same except for the physical form it was presented. And so we looked at a loose form of the supplement versus a pelleted form of that supplement. For the study, we used approximately 60 crossbred heifers. And again, using SmartFeed technology, we set it up to have half of the feed bunks be randomly allotted to one treatment and half allotted to the other. And then a third of the cows were locked out of the feed bunks altogether. To do this with heifers, what we did is prior to the initiation of the study, we put alfalfa pellets in it and did not lock the gates initially just to get them used to feeding, and it seemed to work pretty well. Typically within 4 or 5 days with yearling heifers, you can get them to eat out of these feeders readily. So essentially we had a control group, a pelleted group, a group that got a loose form of the supplement. This is the loose form, this is pelleted, and both of these you can see had pretty much the same composition, and the intake limiter in this case was 25% salt. You know, the cool thing about this is you can break up your study into parts. For Haley's research, we just looked at the first 42 days versus the second 42 days, and here we just had supplement intake. And you can see that we had greater intakes of the pelleted supplement, and that was particularly true in the latter half, or the 42 to 84 day period. And you can see that intake of this supplement increased, part as a function of changing forage quality, but also tolerance to salt. And this was very much what we expected. Kind of the neat thing about the SmartFeed Pro technology is just the different ways to express supplement intake behavior. And here we have intake expressed as grams per minute. And you could also do total time at the feeder or number of bouts when they go to the feeder. You know, there's a number of things you can look at. For us, we kind of like this grams per minute because it tells us a little bit about just intake behavior of the supplement. And you can see with the pelleted supplement that we got greater intake on a per unit time basis, which again is fairly unique. For me personally, one of the things I really like about the new technology is that we can estimate variation in intake. And for most of our papers, we're looking at coefficient of variation of intake, and so variation expressed as a function of the mean. And you can see here that when we provided this in a pelleted form, we didn't actually see a significant effect, but we did see a period effect, with higher variation in the first 42 days. But you can see numerically, it seemed to be a little bit less variation with the pelleted treatment. So I think this whole idea, or the ability to look at intake variation, is one of the really important parts of this technology. Okay, which leads us into kind of the things I wanted to end this talk on, and that's just sort of our experiences. And to this point, it probably sounds a bit like a commercial where I'm telling you how wonderful it is. And the truth is, as most of you know, life's not always puppy dogs and rainbows. And when you work with this technology, I think that's something that you need to be aware of. First of all, training of animals is critical. If you're going to use this technology, you have to train the animals appropriately. With our Northern Ag Research Center cows at Havre, we really kind of had a leg up using this technology because, one of the things that I showed you in the previous slides was that we had less than 5% of the cows that were non-eaters. The reason for this, we believe, is those cows are handled a lot at that research station. They're handled very well. Docility in the herd is an important trait that they select and cull on. And also, every single cow in the Havre herd, as replacement females, went through a post-weaning RFI study, which basically means for a 70-day period, they ate total mixed rations out of grow-safe feeders. So they were not afraid of the feeders. They were used to them. And, now this will be our 5th consecutive winter of using these SmartFeed Pro trailers with this cow herd. And so we have a cow herd trained to use them. And it's probably not likely we're going to stop doing this research just because this cow herd is very used to these feeders and see the feeders as a good thing. For cows that aren't necessarily trained or used to these feeders, what we would recommend is train the animals in a dry lot or confined space. When you do that, you concentrate them in and around the feeder, so they have to at some point get used to it. Also, just sheer boredom and confinement seems to expedite the process. And so for our studies where we've used anything other than heifers, we try to train them in a dry lot or confined area. Probably is going to take more than just 5 to 7 days kind of thing. I'd recommend 2 to 4 weeks, and then monitor intakes of those cows to make sure that they're using the feeders. In our experience, heifers seem to adapt quickly to feed bunks, and maybe that's just yearling heifers being curious. But when we put them out with pastures that have never been exposed or heifers that have never been exposed to them, they're curious, they go up and check them out, and we'll put a highly palatable feed in the feeders prior to the initiation of the study to get them to start using it. We may actually put the supplement outside the feeder and then ultimately try to lure them into it. We may even pin the gates open for a few days and then put something like an alfalfa pellet so that they'll use those feeders. And so I would recommend, you train the animals with highly palatable feedstuffs. Some of the problems I've heard people having is where they'll have, for instance, a mineral that has limiters in it that tries to control intake around 4 to 8 ounces. Well, when you add the added hindrance of putting it in a feed bunk, piece of equipment that the animals might not be familiar with, and many times you just don't end up with intakes. So start with something that they really like, and then move down to what the supplement composition is that you're interested in. The other thing I want to touch on before I kind of wrap things up here is that mechanical failure and what I call cattle thefts are common problems with this technology. The thing you need to know is parts break, and sometimes electronics, even the best made ones, will stop, and particularly in extensive and remote environments. And so be prepared for that. We have a toolkit in every one of our trailers, and we have C-Lock people on speed dial in case we need their help. One time we had a study, and it was actually a study I talked about, Haley White's study looking at the forms of salt limited supplement, where we had one of the 4 gates, the actual lock on the feed gate broke. And we found out basically because we started seeing control animals eating out of just one feeder, and the control animals were supposed to be excluded. We contacted C-Lock. They diagnosed the problem, much like your IT people on campus would do for you, and said, we think you have a broken lock. They express mailed that lock, and a day later we were up and running again. And so, just be aware of that. I think you have to monitor these feed bunks in real time on a daily basis just to be safe. One time we had some heifers consume our modem antenna, and all of a sudden we lost modem service, and we couldn't get any intake data from the feeders, in part because the cows ate the antenna. It's simple modifications, but those things are going to happen. And just this summer we had some batteries go dead, and unfortunately I was helping some grad students set up the trailer, and we neglected to turn on the power switch from our solar panels to the battery, so it was actually operator error. But these are things you just have to watch for. I would recommend every day just checking your feeders, checking the intake, looking at you can access power, what your batteries are doing, and the whole works on the C-Lock website. So monitor feed bunk usage in real time. In my case, I delegate that to my graduate students, but it's something that I ask them to look at on a daily basis. and then if they have a problem, to get back to me. So look for problems. They're going to happen. The system also monitors theft, and one of the things that you know, people will talk about, well, what if you have cows that you don't want to eat supplement and they climb over the feed gate? Well, interestingly enough, is the EID readers will pick up those cows and will actually calculate, you know, inappropriate supplement consumption from cows that weren't supposed to get a particular treatment. We've did 2 or 3 studies now where we had cows excluded or cows on specific supplements, and we found the theft to be relatively minor. But keep in mind, you need to watch that. The studies where we had the biggest problem with theft were actually where we were feeding protein blocks, and they actually stacked up high enough that the cows could look over the feed gate and see them. We've had less problems with theft with loose kinds of supplements, things that fit into the feeders better. So you can calculate consumption from the wrong animals and you know, put that right in your manuscript. And so it's just things you need to be aware of. It's probably going to happen, but it's not that big of a problem, nor has it been significant in our research studies. I also think there's a number of things we can do from a validation perspective. You know, what is appropriate stocking rates, and there's been a couple papers that came out, particularly from Oklahoma State, that sort of looks at this, and I really appreciate those kinds of projects. I also think we need some studies that really compare supplement intake behavior with the SmartFeed Pro, which would be this picture, versus the Super Smart. You know, these are 2 different supplement delivery approaches. Here, the supplement's in the feeder, the cows stick their head in the feeder and the supplement's there, and it just records entry of the cow versus exit. Here, the cow goes in, it reads a sensor, reads the ID of the cow, and then it augers the appropriate amount of supplement out to that cow. Those are 2 very different supplement delivery methods, and so you know, at some point I'd like to see someone you know, look at these 2 different approaches and what's the difference in terms of supplement or nutrient delivery. And then finally, you know, I think all of the research that we're doing with this kind of technology is getting at the effectiveness of these feeders to limit and or more precisely deliver supplements to the cattle in these extensive environments. And so I think there's a lot of research that we still need to do, a lot of questions that still need to be answered. But by and large, I think to wrap things up here, in terms of my final thoughts, I appreciate everyone that's been online this morning. You know, from our perspective, the CLOC technology, the SmartFeed Pro feed units can greatly improve research. It's certainly been an important tool for our research, where roughly 1/3 to 1/2 of our projects are using this kind of technology. We found them to be very reliable in extensive environments. This year, we finally replaced the battery on our white trailers. Not sure if we needed to, but because we have so much invested in research, we decided to go. But we got 4 years of use. The batteries only went dead once, and that was because I didn't turn the system on. And so we found them to be relatively reliable. Occasionally things will go wrong, but you know, we've had good luck with service and support from CLOC. And so with that, I'm going to kind of wrap things up. You know, for my research, I have a lot of support, and I appreciate that support from endowments, things like that, as well as regional grants. So with that, I think Mike, whoever's moderating, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks for the presentation, Tim. It's always nice to, you know, I see the data just behind the scenes, but it's nice to see what kind of feedback you as the customer can come up with for results by the data that we provide you. We do have a couple questions here. The first one, and they actually have an addendum to this question because you addressed part of it throughout your presentation, but the question is, have you looked at using the technology to get a more uniform consumption of material or minerals into cows during the summer grazing? What about the ability to add rumensin to the summer minerals? But then their addendum says, you made a good point with the non-palatable feeds like minerals. My question on summer pasture eating minerals should have said a mineral that was incorporated in a more palatable feedstuff like DDGs, so that intake was better and more consistent.
Right. Well, first of all, very good question. The study that I showed you of white, where we looked at the physical form of supplement, the loose versus pelleted, actually had a mineral package and had lasalicid in that. And so, yeah, I think in part, we have been looking at that. Also, the winter supplements, the first 2 years at the Northern Ag Research Center, we used a Cenex Harvest States supplement that had a mineral package. And then the last 2 years, we've actually used a Bovavox and Bovavox HM that also had a really nice mineral package in it. So, in part, yeah, that is part of it. I think there's certainly a lot of room for research done looking at nutrient delivery of minerals. We focus primarily on just protein in a winter environment for most of our research. But I think the person who asked the question certainly, that's areas that could be studied. I think it's sort of unlimited, the kinds of questions you can get at.
All right, thanks for that. The next question is actually compliment, saying great presentation. And then they also ask, interested in the social dominance in the winter study. They averaged about 3.6 visits per day. How much do you think was related to getting pushed away from the feeder and then coming back?
That's a really good question. And to be honest, I remember talking with Pat and Scott Zimmerman, with CLOC and Mike Pillars, and then other people have used this technology. And one of the concerns I had, is the boss cow's going to stand there at the feeder and shove everything away? Two things that I'd point to that suggest that that's not happening is, one, if you looked at that sort of, supplement intake pattern over the 24-hour period, it was sort of normally distributed, with most of the intake being midday. And when you couple that with the age data, where actually the young cows were eating the most supplement, it would suggest to me that we didn't see that social dominance. And in fact, when the weather got real cold, it appeared the young cows would go to the feeders. And interestingly enough, the old cows would actually seek cover. They'd go and get out of the wind, use the coulees and stuff. And so that was sort of part of what that research was looking like. Historically, and to be honest, there's been several of us that wrote review papers about strategic supplementation of low quality forages. Historically, we've always hypothesized that 5, 6, 7-year-old cow, the boss cows is going to get all the supplement. But our data using this technology suggests, at least with these salt limited supplements, the first 2 years with CLOC and then with Bovavox, that's in fact not the case.
Okay, thanks for that. Next question, and comes with some praise. Many thanks for the very interesting presentation about potential of feeders regarding individual supplement intake, CV, and interaction with age and environment. Quite the goal. But they're asking, what about individual pasture/grassland intake? That's most of the DMI and the resource towards. We are trying to increase efficiency in a sustainable form. How do you measure pasture intake? Internal and external markers?
Yeah, first of all, very good question. And getting individual animal intake has been a goal for range beef cattle nutrition folks forever. I'm sort of ashamed to say that's kind of my area of expertise, and it's challenging. Right now, the best approach is external markers, but we're somewhat limited in what we have to use. You know, I know there's some people interested in this. I'd like to see how it works, but you could, in theory, put external markers into the feed and deliver it via something like the SmartFeed Pro system. Then you'd know actual intake, you'd know the marker concentration of the supplement, and perhaps you could get at it. The problem with that, though, is in our studies, particularly with the salt limited supplements, a lot of variation in intake, so it wouldn't be a uniform distribution of marker. Perhaps in a setting where you had a hand-fed kind of supplement in the feeders, and you set intake to perhaps 2-3 pounds per day, you might be able to use those feeders as a way of getting the marker into them. But just something to think about.
All right, next question. They say, great presentation. Does the SmartFeed system support creep feeding?
You know, I think it could be with some modifications. You know, obviously you could put some creep gates around the feeder that only allows calf access to it. You might need to build, honestly, little ramps that the cattle can walk up on to stick their head into the feeder, that kind of thing. You know, you'd certainly have to adapt it for a smaller calf size, but that would certainly be interesting research, and one that you know, I know Cenex Harvest States, Corey Parsons, and myself and others have talked about.
I might point out that the newer version of the SmartFeed Pros than what you have, you can lower that gate down pretty significantly. To the point we're actually starting to use them with like young dairy cattle. So I think with younger calves, that at least the geometry we could make it work easily.
Good, sounds good. Is that Scott?
Yep.
Yep, very good. How are you, sir?
Oh, doing good.
Good.
All right, next comment was great presentation. Thank you. And the last question that I have on the list here is, thanks very much, Dr. DelCurto. Is there an ideal location to put the SmartFeed Pro trailer in the pasture to ensure the greatest amount of usage, for example, near water?
Yeah, good question, and probably one I should have talked a little bit about. For our case, because we want to monitor them in real time, we actually, particularly in extensive environments, need to put them in a place where we can get cell phone coverage. And so more often than not, we don't put them near water. We actually put them up on ridge tops. You know, again, I think it's important to be able to see the data in real time. And because of that, if there's no hardwire or anything like that, we tend to rely on modems and cell phone coverage. And so, yeah, we typically look around for actually high points in the pasture, but in a sense, they're all going to go to water. And so when we move them up on the ridge tops or high places, we're actually encouraging better use of the pasture as a whole.
Okay, there aren't any more questions. Just had another person say, oh, sorry, another question came in. Great presentation. Do you have any experience using something to limit daily feed intake or complete feed for a large group of animals, 80 to 100 head? I mean, if you offer 4 kilograms per head per day, probably one animal will eat more and other less, and average daily gain will follow the intake. Do you need me to read that again?
Yeah, you might read it again. Let's see.
Okay. Let's see. Do you have any experience using something to limit daily feed intake or complete feed for a large group of animals, 80 to 100 head? I mean, if you offer 4 kilograms per head per day, probably one animal will eat more and other less, and average daily gain will follow the intake.
Okay, I think I understand that. For most of our studies, we actually had the supplement was available free choice, and so there was always feed in the supplement, and we're actually looking at intake variation, you know, as a function of age, environment, things like that. We've also used these with TMRs, of total mixed rations, where we looked at actual ad lib intake, you know, for the entire diet. We've done 2 studies that way, one with 40 cows and one with 60. But here again, we didn't limit intake, we didn't lock them out at a certain level or percent body weight. We're still looking at ad lib intake, and we, you know, it seemed to be where there wasn't really competition for bunk space. They seemed to all eat to their capacity.
All right, we don't have any more questions, just thanks. Thanks, that would be great. Okay, yep, just offering praise for the presentation.
Oh, thank you.
So I will remind people that we did record this presentation and we will have it available at your request. So thank you very much, Tim.
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me.